San Diego County is known for being one of America's most expensive regions. Locals are feeling the squeeze and looking for solutions. KPBS's new series, Price of San Diego, delves into the rising cost of groceries, childcare, car insurance, and even our beloved California burrito. You won't want to miss this ongoing series live now at kpbs.org/Price of San Diego.
Welcome in San Diego, it's Jade Hindman. On today's show, the racial divide in criminal charges as more data show Black defendants are given stiffer penalties when convicted. This is KPBS Midday Edition, connecting our communities through conversation. In California, life without parole can be given for first-degree murder with something called special circumstances. It's commonly seen as an alternative to the death penalty, but it's not free of controversy. Opportunities for appeal are rare, and there are racial disparities. In San Diego County, Black defendants are charged with a special circumstance at a much higher rate than white defendants. And that gap has actually widened under the current district attorney, Summer Stephan. A two-part series is out now on KPBS, and it dives deep into the data behind this analysis. Joining me to talk about it is Katie Hyson. She's KPBS's racial justice and social equity reporter. Katie, hi.
Hi, Jade.
I'm so glad that you are here to talk about this. But before we talk about, what special circumstances are, I want to talk about how this story starts, because you begin your two-part series unraveling the moment a summer day at the park turned deadly and how it would change James Calloway's life thereafter. Can you briefly tell us what happened that day?
Yeah, so James describes himself as an ex-gang member. He says he had turned his life around by this day back in 2022, and he was at a family barbecue with his now wife and his 10-month-old son. And another member of his former gang pulled up to the park on his motorcycle and called James over and pulled two guns on him, saying that he'd heard his wife was a snitch and that he was going to kill him. James says he also threatened his wife and baby. Other people talked the man down, and he got on his motorcycle and drove away, and he stopped nearby. And James ran to his car and pulled up next to him and shot him dead. And James says that he felt that he had no other choice to defend his family.
That is very heavy. And I can appreciate that you start this story really bringing humanity back into it, because so often when we're talking about data, it's detached from people. So tell me a bit about why you decided to do that.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's so important before we get into talking data and numbers that we really grasp that there's not just a person, but a family and a community behind each one of those numbers. And when we talk about life without parole, I think it's easy to fill in the void in our imagination with cases we think would deserve it, what we imagine to be the worst of the worst murder cases. James is one of about 5,000 people serving life without parole in California, and his case is complicated. And actually, the first degree murder charge is not why he was sentenced to die in prison. If he had walked up and shot the man, he could have the chance at parole. But because he fired from a vehicle, the DA could and did charge him with a special circumstance.
How did you learn about this issue? I mean, did you come across the data or the Calloway family's story first?
It was kind of a both and. I've been keeping an eye on these special circumstance cases since I began reporting on racial justice in San Diego, including James's case. And it was one of the first issues community members brought to my attention to, and seemingly one of the most urgent for them. They have consistently said that there are racial disparities in these charges, but we just didn't have access to the data we needed to back that. And so I've been combing through these Racial Justice Act appeals for these cases as they come up. And I noticed recently that the Public Defender's Office had managed to get their hands on the data. So I started with that data and then I looked through a stack of cases before choosing James's to highlight, in part because it's one that community advocates have really rallied behind.
Well, before we get into that data, I think, it's important to discuss these special circumstances in California murder law. In your story, you wrote that there's this long, complex history with special circumstances that now weighs on James Calloway, and you captured some of that emotion. Here's a clip.
It's been extremely hard just thinking about not being able to hold my son, just not being able to be a father. Come on, man. And then you got to think I have to be strong for them, too. They can't see me in here breaking down.
Tell us a little bit about the history of these special circumstances.
It was such a crazy rabbit hole to go down because when I first saw the list of these special circumstances that can lead to life without parole, it looked like such a strangely specific and almost arbitrary patchwork of a list. I didn't understand why, for example, killing someone with poison would necessarily be more deserving of dying in prison than, say, shooting someone. So I started to track back how each one of those dozens of circumstances got added to the list. And what I found really surprised me. So the list was created in the 70s to make life without parole and the death sentence less arbitrary. The Supreme Court thought that those sentences were being given out too randomly, and they needed to have some kind of criteria to make sure only the worst of the worst cases were getting these sentences. Well, almost immediately, propositions started being added to state ballots to expand the list. And I found these old voter guides over the decades, and they use this kind of scary language referring to famous murderers of the day like Charles Manson and the Zodiac Killer to persuade Californians to add more special circumstances. And so by the 90s, almost all murders were considered the worst of the worst by that list and eligible for life without parole.
Interesting. Well, back to the data, an analysis from San Diego's Office of the Public Defender found that Black defendants are charged with a special circumstance at a rate nearly 3 times higher than that of white defendants. What did the researchers and advocates you interviewed say about this finding?
What's interesting is, as you mentioned, that was the public defender's office. They had hired this statistician for their case. And so I reached out to UCLA's Special Circumstances Project just to get an outside expert eye on it. And the director said, great timing. We just got a windfall of data from San Diego County. Do you want to look at it? Which was like a reporter's dream for me. And they worked on their own analysis for me, which went much deeper and really showed that even when you statistically control for differences between cases and per capita arrest rates and everything that the district attorney uses to reason away this gap, Black San Diegans are still getting charged with special circumstances at significantly higher rates. And these researchers found that racial gap is much more extreme here than it is in nearby counties like LA.
Wow. Well, the data show this gap has gotten much wider under District Attorney Summer Stephan than it was under the previous District Attorney, Bonnie Dumanis. The jump from 5 times more likely under Dumanis to about 23 times more likely under Stephan is really, it's just striking. What does that number represent in real-world terms? Cases, people, decisions?
Yeah, and that statistic is specifically for felony murder special circumstances. And in simplest terms, so Stephan and Dumanis both charge special circumstances at about the same rate in murder cases overall. But when Stephan was elected, her office began charging eligible white people less often with special circumstances and eligible Black people more often, which widened this racial disparities gap significantly.
I'd ask why that is, but the district attorney's office declined an interview. But they did send you an email in response. So what did it say?
Basically, it said that these statistics represent fluctuations in crime and who commits crime that are outside their control and don't reflect a shift in how their office prosecutes. They also argued that percentages were not a good way to analyze racial disparities. I will say the UCLA researcher, I sent her their response, and she did then refute both of those arguments with further analysis.
Well, the Office of the Public Defender, I know, has accused the district attorney of having no standard criteria for when they charge specials. Has the district attorney responded to that?
This is something they've said consistently for years. They say they charge special circumstances whenever there's enough evidence, regardless of race. It is hard to see how that matches with what we're seeing just in the raw data. For example, any first degree murder case, any case with two or more murders could be charged with a special for that. But under Stephan, the rate of that charge against eligible people fell for every people group except Black people. It rose against Black people by 17%. So community advocates and researchers and public defenders are really still waiting on more accountability from Stephan's office.
There is a law designed to help reduce disparities in sentencing. You mentioned it in your story, the Racial Justice Act, and you say, petitions for resentencing rarely succeed. Why is that?
What I've heard from both local advocates who are watching these cases unfold in our local courthouse and from researchers at the state level is that district attorneys around the state are fighting these appeals very aggressively, and that the district attorneys don't want to see these sentences change.
Did advocates tell you what meaningful transparency or reform might look like in response to this analysis?
So there's a lot of different ideas for reform, but I was told the most immediately accessible and most effective is voting. The district attorney is elected, and they have complete discretion in whether to bring special circumstance charges forward in a case. So if the public doesn't like how the current DA is using their discretion, they can vote for a different DA in the next election, which in San Diego is in 2028.
Do you think those efforts hit a snag when faced against those who prioritize punishment and the rights of victims' families?
Yeah, ultimately, the DA holds the power here. So they could change these sentences with a stroke of the pen, and they could they could choose not to charge special circumstances in the first place. So if the DA decided to get behind these efforts, we would see change.
Well, I know this series just came out, but what's the response been so far?
I had heard from one community advocate who said that when she went to court yesterday, the attorneys and the people she shared it with had all already read the story. So it sounds like it's making the rounds, at least within the local justice system.
Well, what's next for James Calloway?
He has filed a motion requesting resentencing based on racial bias in his case. His attorney plans to bring up these statistics, and that hearing is in April.
What other stories or issues are you focusing on these days?
There's a lot that's caught my eye. I'm not sure yet what will become a published story, but I am interested in what it takes to get the district attorney to choose to prosecute a domestic violence case. I'm hearing that most DV cases get dropped and never make it to court. And so I want to understand why and where that leaves the victims.
Before we go, I have to ask, since this series is gaining a lot of traction, what are your hopes for raising awareness about this?
I just hope that there's a really good look taken at this data that we now have access to, and just that the question gets asked, given when we compare even cases that have the same charges, that this disparity remains, that we ask why that is, um, and hold the district attorney's office accountable for answering for that gap.
We'll keep asking the right questions. I've been speaking with Katie Hyson. She's KPBS's racial justice and social equity reporter. Katie, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jade.
That's our show for today. I'm your host, Jade Hindman. Thanks for tuning in to Midday Edition. Be sure to have a great day on purpose, everyone.
KPBS has partnered with StoryCorps for the One Small Step program. We invite you to sign up to have a conversation with a person that may have different views, so you may talk, not about politics, but to understand each other better. Sign up at kpbs.org/onesmallstep.